Um,
Oh, there we go. Hello, hello.
Hi.
Oh, okay. I was having a problem with my sound, but I have it now.
We heard everything.
Well, I heard nothing, but it's okay now. So I guess we could start the meeting.
Yeah, great. And hi, CJ.
Hello, good evening. Would you like to kick off with just a quick agenda review?
That's totally fine. Do we need Sue?
Sue's gonna go off the recording. Yeah, I'm recording it in live streaming, so she'll be able to follow up with the minutes after that.
Great, wonderful. Yeah. So Tom, do you want to launch ahead?
Yeah, okay. So do we have to approve the minutes, or did we agree that that wasn't necessary?
Oh, okay, that may have just been held over from the other agenda. No, you don't have to approve minutes.
Yeah.
No. Okay, I'll make a note to strike that.
Okay, and are there any public comments?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, we'll assume that there aren't. And then David Kay is going to make a presentation.
I could when you want me to.
Go ahead.
We'd love you to.
Thanks for being here, David.
Yeah, I mean, I can do this, but maybe CJ, could you give me a little background again, just sort of about what your interests are as a group?
Yeah, so the Conservation Advisory Council is fairly new. I mean, I guess I could speak for all of you. Less than a year, essentially, old here in the town of Lansing, and we've been working actually fairly extensively with Cornell Cooperative Extension through Terry and Samu, who was with CCE before he went to Tetra Tech, on a natural resources inventory. It's kind of the foundational document before we move into an open space index. And just as a bit of background, the town is working on a solar and wind local law amendment to the land use ordinance. So as we know, that's probably, or maybe moot in the face of the new Office of Renewable Energy siting. But given that you have written a lot about the challenges of this large scale siting, the Conservation Advisory Council, I think, and feel free to chime in, any member is interested in how the CAC could continue to play a role in those type of land use decisions.
Okay, and
maybe just to jump in a little bit here, maybe we should just quickly introduce the folks who are on the screen for you, David, just because it's a mixture. And oh, hi, Sue. Just might be nice. You probably know everybody, but just for us.
Not everybody, but I do know a fair number of you. So
yeah. So we know each other. Carrie and Tom. You want to just mention?
I'm Tom Butler. Carrie and I are co-chairs of this committee. I've seen some of your stuff before and read the 2-page document, and it sure looks like large-scale solar is the way it's going to go in the future here.
We'll get to that. Yeah, David Wolf, I know. Sue, I don't know you, I don't think.
Hi, I actually am just working on taking minutes.
Okay.
She's our code clerk.
Very important job as a former planning
town
board member. People like you a lot. John Greeley.
I'm John Greeley. I'm just trying to figure out how to be useful here.
Okay. And Terry, I know. Amy.
Hi there, I'm Amy. I'm new to CCE. I'm actually a recent Cornell grad from this month.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And I am working with Terry with the Energy Smart Communities program.
Great, great.
Welcome, Amy.
Thank
Should
you.
talk to you more later, along with Terry more. I haven't caught up with him in a while. And Karen, I know. How about Robin?
Hey, I'm Robin Bailey. I'm an ornithologist, and I know very little about solar power, but I'm interested to learn more and just also trying to be helpful on the committee. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you. It's nice to meet those of you I don't know and to see again those I do know. I'm going to give a very slightly updated version of a very short PowerPoint that I gave at the recent Ag Summit. And CJ and the rest of you, I'm available if you want to ask me questions about a bunch of things that I didn't cover in this. I could try and answer them. I know Terry and probably Amy at this point, and maybe some others of you know a lot of things too. So we can, and as an introduction, my focus is really on large scale utility scale solar and the large scale utility. That's what I've been working on recently. But we can talk about the new law later if you want. I don't have much in my PowerPoint about it, but there will continue, I'm sure, to be a role for no matter what happens with the large scale, there will continue to be a role for 20 mega for local governments to be in the lead, not just making comments to the state, but in the lead on smaller scale, which will, some of the smaller scale ones, facilities are pretty big, compared to what we've seen so far. So that as an introduction, let me see if I could just share my screen. Share. Are you seeing something now?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, let me get it started as a slideshow. Okay, is that good?
Great.
Okay, I do work with the Community and Regional Development Institute, which is part of Cornell's brand new, at this point, part of Cornell's brand new Department of Global Development as of the beginning of the year. So I'm just going to start with, I think, a really important question to which there's not really a good answer, but it's kind of critical in thinking about these issues, which is how much solar electric the state is going to need. So this is and I'm speaking mostly from a high level perspective. I have been on planning board, the city of Ithaca planning board a long time myself. So I'm pretty aware of the kinds of, if you will, site level decisions that need to be made. But this is what I'm going to be talking about today is a much higher level, kind of state level overview type presentation. So in response to that, the state response has been the market will decide the mix. So that's one of the reasons it's very hard to predict or to use even for planning purposes beyond using scenario kind of thinking. It's very hard to predict how much is going to be solar or large scale solar in relation to meeting the state's now legislated goals for getting off of carbon. So you can't get, whereas there are some specific targets in the new laws that were passed, there is not a specific target for how much large scale utility scale solar we will use as a state. That said, there's lots of different ways to sort of project on this, both the demand and the supply side, how much we're going to need and where's it going to come from. And so I'm just using a reasonable estimate or guesstimate that someone else did here that ultimately New York might need about 23 gigawatts of solar. which is, if you look at the kind of solar that we're the most used to already, which has been promoted for quite some time by the New York Sun program, which is what they call distributed solar. Distributed solar is defined different ways by different people, but in sort of the regulatory legislative context that NYSERDA and the state are using it, distributed solar can be thought of as facilities that are 5 megawatts or less, 5 megawatts. So here we're talking about that we need about 20 gigawatts, according to this estimate. And that's from PV Magazine. But you know, there's a big error bar around that estimate. It could be a lot more, it could be a lot less. So just to put that in context, I just threw up what is the total US electric generating capacity additions that came online in 2019 for the whole United States. Just by chance, it happened to be about 23 gigawatts. So, you know, I don't know how useful a benchmark that is, but I found it just kind of interesting to throw up there as just kind of something to contextualize what we're talking about. We'll talk about some other ways of thinking about how much that is. So, as I mentioned, to keep this short, I'm just going to talk about a subset of projects and characteristics of projects that are currently in the NYSO queue. So again, to be in this queue to begin with, you know, I think the smallest proposal in the queue is something for solar is something around 10 megawatts. If a project is in the queue, it doesn't mean it's going to be built. Doesn't even mean the developer is necessarily going to actively pursue it being built, but it does mean that they've made some investment in acquiring the rights from landowners to develop, and they have some plans about it. So, and NYSO is the organization which really governs the interconnection to the grid in New York State, and there's similar organizations you know, in other states around the country. And some of them are regional, some of them are very specific to one state. So part of what I'm trying to say here is I'm only looking at a subset of the projects that are likely to be seen. And I'm not looking in this context at hardly any of the projects that are the ones that are most likely under the new law to go to primary review by a town or village or city board. These are all likely, almost all of them likely to go through the state under the new law. Here is a chart that kind of like organizes some of the information about what's in the queue. And there, well, you know what you can see there is if you look at the size of the blue bars, it tells you the number of projects that are in the queue, which is the axis. I don't know on your screens, on my screen, that's the one on the right in the blue with the blue label. And the red line shows you by the what they call nameplate capacity, how much is in the queue. So the bottom line for me to take out of this chart is that there are lots and lots of projects, like over 60 that are, which is a lot, that are you know, clocking in right at 20 megawatts in size. And there's some reasons for that, like why 20, why not a different number, but I won't go into those right now. However, if you look at the, if you look at where sort of where the proposals are in terms of how are we going to get to the state's goals, remember 23 gigawatts. What we're seeing here is about, just in that very largest category, over 6 gigawatts are just in the largest size category that I show here. So what I'm trying to say is that there's going to be a lot of small projects, undoubtedly, but in terms of meeting the state's goals, the way we're headed is most of the capacity will be met by a relatively small number of very large projects. That's kind of the bottom line for this one. That could change in the future, but that's where we're headed now. And by the way, well, we'll talk about this in a minute. So a further subset of projects in that queue is projects which are currently actively under review under the state's Article 10 siting law, which is still more or less operative, although it's now been replaced by this new law, which just got passed as part of the state budget. So Article 10 essentially says and it's not just about solar, it's about any kind of electricity generating facility. But if you're a 25 megawatt or greater in terms of generating capacity, they call it nameplate capacity. If you're that size or larger, you're required to go through the state siting board. And there are currently about 40 solar projects in some stage or other of review by the state. And there's 6 stages of review. So what I have here is kind of a summary of how much capacity is in each of those stages. So I'm not going to go in detail, but what you can see is there are a very large number of projects with a total capacity, an aggregate of about 4.3 gigawatts that are in the very beginning stages of review. And there's only 2 projects that have made it past step 3 of this review, and that there are no projects that have completed. There are no solar projects. There's some wind projects, but there are no solar projects that have completed state review under Article 10. So, and for better or worse, and I think there are some better and some worse, one of the reasons that the new law was passed was because some people were frustrated with the slow process of going through Article 10. And so the state passed this new siting legislation, which will be going into effect. It's already law, but it's going to take a while for it to actually be implemented. If you look at all the projects in this review, and again, not all of these are likely to be built either, because not every project, as I'm sure you know, not every project that's proposed gets a permit for a variety of reasons and ends up being built. But if they were all built, it would be about 6.5 gigawatts of sort of planned capacity in relation to the roughly 20 to 23 that I said the state might ultimately need. Here is a map showing where those 40 projects are. These are like digitized boundaries that were available from the public filings and the maps that are filed regarding these. And the green background, so this presentation is a little bit slanted towards looking at impacts on agricultural lands, because there's a lot of interest in that topic. So the green background in this slide shows you where the state's agricultural district boundaries are. And basically what you see here, if you look at where these are, it's kind of what I think of sometimes as a solar belt that starts over in Western New York, kind of skips most of the southern tier, but kind of goes through central New York and then curves around both sides of the Adirondack Park. Very little downstate. There are a few projects down in Long Island. And if you look at my 2-page policy brief, which I put in the chat, and I think you might have already seen, we talk a little bit about why that might be the case. Here's an example of one project. It's just an example to sort of show a little more about, so here are the project boundaries in the orange line. This is Morris Ridge, it's out in Livingston County. And it's overlaid on a soil map of prime farm of, different kind of soil types. And there's a lot of interest, particularly in soils that support They're classified as prime farmland or prime farmland if drained in particular. And what you can see is here, firstly, this 175 megawatt proposed facility, the boundaries include a lot of farmland, or at least farm soils. I'm going to throw a little bit more data up there. So if you look at just the percentage of the acreage within that boundary, 65% of that acreage is good agricultural soils. If you look at the second little box down there, the entire area in that orange boundary is 24 square miles. That said, so that's like early, this map was put out early in the permitting phase. But if you look at the other part that's highlighted in red, ultimately, even though there's 24 square miles of land that's kind of the project boundary, the actual solar panels are probably going to cover a much smaller proportion of that site, like less than 2 square miles. So this is one of the issues, that's kind of inevitable, is like a developer comes in, almost always, not always, but almost always is going to come in with a much larger site that they have control over, and they're going to go through what I would think of if it was at the local level, something like a site plan review process, and they're going to have to take into account a lot of ultimately what the regulatory body says they can and can't do, and they're not going to cover 100% of the acreage. They won't be allowed to cover 100% of the acreage, and they don't plan to cover 100% of the acreage usually with solar panels, or even with sort of the accessories that they need to make this work. In this particular case, if you took the 1.6 square mile estimate of how much land actually would be covered and divide it by the number of megawatts, you come up with an estimate of a little less than 6 megawatts per acre, which is very much in line with sort of the standard experience that people have, which is kind of a good number to keep in the back of your head with these things if you care about land use, which is roughly 5 to 10 acres of solar are required per megawatt of capacity. I only have a couple more slides. So what categories of land cover are actually within the proposed Article 10 project boundaries, all 40 of them that we were able to get the maps for? This shows you, again, taking into account some of these boundaries, particularly if they're in the early stages of review, they tend to be very large. And then as time goes on, they kind of shrink down more and more towards further in review towards where the facility is actually likely to be constructed. And this is a mix of mostly projects in the earlier stages, but some in later stages of review. But overall, the bottom line here, I would say, is if you just look at that land that's in the boundaries, surprise, surprise, in most of those places in upstate New York, a lot of it's farmland. A lot of the rest of it is forest land. And most of the rest of it is wetlands. So, and a very small proportion of the rest of it is sort of in a whole bunch of other accumulated categories. And this is just to clarify, this is based on land use land cover satellite data, which is, so it's basically a photo interpretation of what's on the land. It's not the previous data I was showing you was about the soils. This is more about the actual land use that got categorized in these ways. Back to the soils within these boundaries. So here we see that, a different kind of take at what's there. Instead of looking at what the land use is, this looks at the land suitability for farming based on a soil type. And you see here that, again, that about roughly half is in the prime farmland category. About a third is in another category, which varies from state to state. The prime farmland categories are national categories. The statewide ones are sort of defined by each state. So about a third is defined as farmland of statewide importance. And then about a quarter is not prime farmland. So again, this is just what's there right now. Doesn't necessarily, it may be an indicator of the future, but it's not intended as a prediction of what's actually going to be covered, but it is what they're looking at right now. And we looked at it some other ways, but that's kind of the basic story. The basic story really is that this land, for a whole bunch of reasons, particularly farmland, is attractive, particularly for large scale development, for a whole bunch of reasons. So here, someone asked, last time I did this, they kind of brought up the question of, because there's a lot of attention, particularly in the sort of farm and food community, about shouldn't we be saving our prime soils because, you know, we'll need them for food in the future. So there was there was a request I did this since the last presentation to sort of look at, if you look at different soil types, how are those soils actually being, you know, used at the moment in terms of their land uses. And what you can see is about, you know, as I haven't read here, there's more acreage and pasture and hay than row crops in all of the different soil types that I looked at. Well over half, but nowhere near 100% of the prime soils were being farmed. This is based on 2011 data, by the way. And some of even the least well-suited soils are actually in farms. So there's not a one-to-one correspondence right now by any means between the best soils and farm soils. So people should be aware of that when they think about policy goals. And this is, I think, my last slide. So if you again just look at these 40 Article 10 projects, 6.5 gigawatts of capacity, they're located in 28 counties in New York. And if you just like contrasted the actual acreage within those boundaries that you could say might largely be dedicated to solar with the percentage of all soils within those counties with agriculture, all soils with agricultural potential in those 28 counties, what would you get? So I got 1.8% of all soils with agricultural potential in these counties are currently dedicated to these proposed projects. And it's about 1.4% of the prime farmland soils in those 28 counties. Well, but that's just like what's on the table as possibilities for now. What if we were to like say, hey, we want to get all of the 20 gigawatts. And by the way, the difference between 20 and 23 gigawatts, which I said earlier was that other estimate, is we're expecting about 3 gigawatts of solar capacity to come from smaller scale projects. And about half of that's already in place, but there's a lot more already in the pipeline. So I'm using 20 gigawatts here, roughly 3 times the 6.5 gigawatt capacity gets us around to, pretty close to what might be the projected need for the state. And that turns into, if it was exactly the same composition and same types of locations, that would just multiply those other numbers by 3. It's about 6% of all soils with agricultural potential in those 28 counties, and about 4% of the prime farmland soils in those counties would be dedicated to solar. There's other stuff. I know I didn't want to go on too much longer because you might have questions that would be more useful to talk about, and I don't really know how much time you have. There's a lot of work going on right now, which Cornell and many other places are involved in, trying to look at the suitability or the compatibility, I should say, of solar with agriculture. It kind of goes under the label of co-location. There's research happening about pollinators, about grazing, about crops, a whole bunch of different ideas, what works and what doesn't work with solar. There's a bunch of policy issues related to that. There are hardly any sort of like firm scientifically based conclusions that I'm aware of yet, because it's a pretty new area of research. You know, we have, you know, I think based on sort of the kind of policies that are in place and the way that, you know, concerns about climate change and about energy supply are going, we have only seen the tip of the iceberg. So I'll leave it at that. Any reactions or questions or comments or?
I have a question about the benefits to the farmer. Can they make more money by leasing their land for a solar facility than they can for producing agricultural crops?
In many, if not most cases, the answer to that is yes. It's also much, you know, I'd say in addition to that, it's much lower risk and no work.
Okay.
So it, you know, so for, you know, and remember, this is not like condemning land to use. It's like almost always this is going to happen when a landowner signs a lease to, you know, willingly, quote unquote, willingly signs a lease. I mean, they may feel compelled to do it because they're trying to save their farm from going under or for many other reasons. But it's sort of their choice to sign. You know, one of the things that, you know, just as with natural gas leasing, you know, one of the issues that is there is I think a lot of landowners are not necessarily that well informed about what kinds of leases are in their best interest and which ones aren't in their best interest. But you know, put that aside, they're not compelled to sign. I will also point out, you know, in agriculture, there's a lot of land that farmers farm that they don't own, that they actually lease the land from another landowner. And there are plenty of cases, some in our county I'm aware of already, where the landowner has decided, hey, I can make, you know, a decision that's, you know, for whatever reasons makes sense to them economically usually, but sometimes it's, you know, based on their desire to fight climate change. They say, I'm going to put my land to use harvesting the sun for electricity rather than for food. And in so doing, the farmer who was leasing that land has no say in it. And they may have been improving the land or farming it for many years at that point. So there's some tension around that issue.
I had a couple questions, David. On this last slide here that you're showing, you mentioned 28 counties. Those are the 28 counties that are shown on the map in your presentation and also in your paper?
Yeah, they're the 28 counties. The distinction of those 28 counties is just that there is currently a proposed large-scale solar facility undergoing state review. So I'm not saying that those are the only counties in which large-scale solar will be proposed. That's just kind of like looking backwards where they have been proposed right now. But I will say that there's some reasons that have to do with economies of scale and cost of land assembly and proximity. You know, there's a whole bunch of reasons why these facilities are being cited there and not, you know, not seemingly paradoxically, why aren't they being cited in the Hudson River Valley close to where much closer to where the demand centers are in downstate? Because that's where the electricity ultimately needs to go. And it's mostly economic and practical reasons.
Yeah. So Tompkins County would not be included right now in these 28 counties. And certainly Lansing would not be included then. And there are prime farmland soils in Lansing. So one of our interests is really to try to be balancing, economics with a preservation of this prime farmland. And just looking at your slide here and the capacity, the 6% of soils with ag potential, 4% of prime land. But in thinking about Lansing, if we were to have a great big facility here, it could really be quite devastating to prime farmland. And I'm just curious in your take on that.
Well, sure. I mean, like, what is, think about 24 square miles. How big is the town of Lansing? I don't remember offhand.
73 square miles.
That's a third of the town. If it was this now, to be honest, I think it'd be pretty unlikely. They aren't coming to Tompkins County already. Why aren't they in Tompkins County already? Here we are. We're one of the most pro renewable energy counties in the entire state. So why aren't they here already? Well, I think there's some reasons for that.
I think it's
So I don't think
because
it's that likely that
they
these
keep
really
saying
big
no.
ones will come here.
Oh, no, they're
What's that?
here. They're here. They're
No,
here.
not these big ones. I mean, solar's obviously already here, but I think it's more, I mean, I don't know, but I think that there's some, like, how much is the cost of to lease an acre of farmland in Tompkins County?
Town of Lansing, you mean for solar or for agriculture?
For ultimately for solar, but I mean, what I'm trying to say is Tompkins County land is not the cheapest land to get hold of. If you're trying to look, where am I going to put this in New York State on the one hand, and also, what's the, if you look at parcel sizes and the number of people that they have to, this is part of what's in my brief. You think about like where a solar developer is going to go and, they have to negotiate to gain site control with lots and lots of landowners to get very large acreages generally. The places that it's easiest to do that is where, landowners on very large acreages, so they don't have to negotiate with as many. And I don't, you could, in our county, maybe Lansing is a place to do that, but in the state as a whole, it's not the greatest place to do that. I'm not trying to say I totally anticipate more solar development in this county, but I don't think this is going to be the first place that the really big developments are going to come. And that's just like based on, to some extent, informed guesstimate. It's not like I would take it with a huge grain of salt because I could completely be wrong. But
I think the big difficulty is that, in Tompkins County, the transmission really isn't conducive to some of these large scale ones. And, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, the one transmission line that could handle something of this size, happens to be in the town of Lansing. It's where the power plant, basically was. So, if it is going to come, it's likely going to come first to the town of Lansing before you start to see it at, any of these other municipalities in Tompkins County. So, that's something to consider. I think you only have to look up the lake, not too far to see one of the largest solar farms that's been proposed in New York State. I think it is the largest solar farm that's been proposed in New York State, is just up the lake from Lansing. So, I think like David said, I think it's a little hard to predict at this point what's going to happen, especially with some of the changes in the law. And, there's a transmission proceeding that's going on at the Public Service Commission that's been started to see how they can change how transmission operates in Tompkins or in the state, how the permitting for transmission goes. So there's a lot of things in flux right now.
Right. And, another thing, which I think, within Tompkins County makes Lansing quite suitable, let's say, relative to the southern towns in the county is, look at this map and think about topography. Where is nothing that's large being proposed? It's in the Catskills, it's in the southern tier, It's in the Adirondacks. And not the only reason, but one of the main reasons is because those are hilly places, not flat places. So Lansing is relatively flat.
Dave Wolf, I just have a question about, you went through kind of quickly those steps of review, and maybe some others in the group are more familiar with what really goes on there, but to what extent is there something that's the equivalent of an environmental impact statement? Like, can they come in and cut down forest? Can they remove all the vegetation and lead to erosion into Salmon Creek? You know, this sort of thing. Or is there any, do they have to have a plan for how they're going to manage the vegetated surface or anything like that with this process?
So are you, I assume you're familiar in general with municipal site plan review processes?
A little bit, but not much. Yeah.
So, I mean, the bottom line is that, so when, you know, there's two regimes which are in the process of transition. One regime is the state level review process, which is again, has been anything above 25. Now it's a little complicated, but you could say it's anything above 20 megawatts is likely to go through state review in the future. That's 100 acres or more. Smaller than that, which I anticipate our county will continue to see a lot of development of, goes through the municipal board, town, village, city. So that, you know, anytime something like this is proposed, if the town has nothing like a site, I mean, in Tompkins County we do, but you know, we don't have zoning in some of our towns. We do have, I think we have site plan review in every town though. I'm not totally up to date on that. But anyway, I'm saying there has to be some permit that gets triggered at the local level and it's usually most likely to be a site plan or a subdivision or possibly a zoning change kind of rule that would be required. And when that happens, it's actually the language in your local law that matters the most. And that varies from place to place. So one of the reasons that I'm sure the county and a lot of other places and at the state level, they promote adoption of local solar laws is because of this. And I don't know whether Lansing, CJ, I'm sure you would know whether you already have one. You know, the other thing that happens in general is if there is a permit required, that triggers the state SECRA law, State Environmental Quality Review Act, which does, you know, so there's kind of like, and that state law, which is the environmental review law, works kind of in tandem with the whichever local law it is. Sometimes they overlap seemingly almost 100%, and sometimes they have different authorities and goals. So, but there is a review, and under the state law, you know, sort of the phrase of art is that if the municipality or the reviewing body determines that there is a significant, in quotes, environmental impact, which is a matter, some things are not easy to decide whether they're significant, others are matters of judgment. But if there is one, then the municipality is required to mitigate those impacts to the quote maximum extent practicable. Also, there's case law which determines what that might mean, but you know, it's also judgment call usually.
But this is just to follow up, one more question kind of related to that, just to follow up is, so right now we're in the middle of doing this natural resources inventory for the Lansing town, and you know, that will provide information relevant to areas that are more vulnerable to environmental impacts, such as a slope going towards a water body or that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Are there things we should be thinking about as we put that document together and as we maybe report to the board about what we're deliberating about, that could help avoid make it more difficult for a really bad idea of a solar farm to happen?
Absolutely. I mean, and there's lots of work going on now, I would say everywhere from the national level down to the super local level about, how do we think about encouraging development on quote unquote, some people call it least impact sites. Absolutely necessary, important to, get your ducks in a row as a municipality by determining what kinds of land are, and by the way, some kinds of land, let me put this another way, like there already are, I wouldn't say necessarily strong enough, but there are already state and federal laws in place through the Army Corps of Engineers and DEC to protect, for example, wetlands. Doesn't mean that these things won't impact wetlands, but there's kind of legislation in place that's pretty hard for a developer to say, oh, I'm just going to get around that or ignore it. It's hard for the municipality to ignore it too. They're going to get sued if very likely. There's also issues about much lesser protection for forest land unless there's some local law in place. But if you look at what protects ag land, which is really the most attractive land at the, out of the box for these kinds of developers, yes, we have ag districts law, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But like if a farmer wants to do this, there aren't really strong protections in place protecting farmland. Maybe there should be, maybe there shouldn't be, but the reality is there isn't.
So then that leads to things like thinking about organizations like American Farmland Trust that might work with farmers to put farmland into trust, the land trust.
That's true. I mean, a municipality could, you have if you want it to be sort of, if you will, seen as, well, I won't even go use the labels, but you have it within your authority at the municipal level to enact zoning, which says which land uses are appropriate, within which zones. So you could say, like we don't actually have in New York State. This is not directly related to solar, but for example, Pennsylvania has exclusive agricultural zoning, which says, hey, if you're in an agricultural zone, essentially all you can do is agriculture. Most New York State agricultural zones allow agriculture, but they don't prevent a lot of other things from happening, including development. And it's mostly, historically, it's been mostly concerned about, about residential or, scattered rural development that's been the biggest concern. But, there is this term, which I think can be appropriate, about sort of energy sprawl, poorly planned energy development. It transforms landscapes too. It doesn't have the same impacts on the farmer or the landscape as residential, but it definitely has impacts. But at the same time, you have to say, like, you also need to think about, and this is, go back to the fracking debates. One of the things that was already in place and required was in addition to the kind of work that everybody would do at the municipal level in terms of a comprehensive plan and zoning that was, and land use regulations that were consistent with the comprehensive plan, the state required a generic environmental impact statement for the whole state, because they were trying to look at the big picture of the impacts of fracking. Well, we're not going to do that pretty clearly for maybe some good reasons, maybe from not so good reasons, for renewable energy. We've made a commitment as a state to getting off of fossil fuels for reasons that I'm guessing that everybody probably on this call actually agrees with pretty strongly. So the question becomes, like, where is this going to go? And it's pretty clear in terms of it's pretty clear in terms of the total amount of acreage that is needed to do this, that it's not a very large percentage of the state's land. But as you were saying, like if they put all of the facilities in one town like Lansing, or even one county, you know, that would have an enormous impact on that community. And some of these very big sites are going to have very large impacts on the communities they're in. But, you know, there's no, you know, one thing I learned a long time ago when I started working on energy back in the 70s was, and we were working on hydropower then, was like, there's no such thing as a free lunch when you start talking about the scale of transformation needed to get off of fossil fuels. So there will be negative impacts, and we have to decide how do we fairly allocate those, and you know, and compensate as much as possible, and avoid the worst impacts and maximize the benefits appropriately, but at multiple scales.
I want to give the folks on the phone a chance to ask a quick question, and then we'll probably move on to Terry Carroll with a lot of gratitude for this really interesting presentation. So Karen and Robin.
I'm just listening and learning. I think I learned a lot, especially about the percentage of potentially impacted land in the state. Seems reasonable to me. So I appreciate this. This is really interesting and I learned a lot.
And thank you, David. Now I don't have any questions.
And just as a question back to you, Karen, I mean, you did a lot of work on fracking using the same tools I'm using. So I'm wondering, you know, if you have any follow-up you want to do offline, I'd be happy to talk to you more.
I wanted to make one comment. At least the small ones here in Lansing, on the planning board, we've made sure that any farmland that is used for solar has the potential to go back to farmland in 20 or 30 years afterwards. So it's not like we're destroying the farmland. It has agricultural potential in the future.
So I would say that's like, you know, I think that's clearly some version of what you're talking about is clearly likely to emerge as a universal best practice. You know, figuring out exactly what that means. I mean, it has a lot to do with good construction management. It's one of the reasons that people, for example, are interested in, you know, in grazing and pollinator crops and are trying to avoid things like putting, you know, the entire site under gravel, you know, if it's a green field to start with, avoiding gravel or concrete or asphalt or something like that. I will say the only caution I'm going to put out, well, I think that's a totally important thing to be doing, just, you know, and in general to think about the issues of decommissioning. If they're, you know, at the end of the useful life of this facility. My one sort of caveat, which is a really hard thing to think about in the present, is, you know, it's pretty, as we're finding out, it's not that easy to site these facilities to begin with. And they need a lot of, you know, they need the infrastructure that connects them to the grid, et cetera, et cetera. So I wouldn't necessarily, I don't know, because I can't look 30 years in the future, but you know, once it's in solar, I think that, you might say, if we're going to stay off of fossil fuels in the future, and we're depending on renewable energy, you know, just because the life of that facility ends after 20 to 30 years, economically doesn't mean that there's not going to be another form of renewable energy or solar again staying on that site. So I wouldn't say, oh, it's only 30, it's guaranteed to only be a 20 to 30 year life, and then it's going to go back to farming.
Well, thanks, David. This is helpful.
Yes, thanks a lot. That was great.
We
Thanks
appreciate
for
it. You're
inviting
welcome.
me. You know, we're continuing. There's there's probably like at least half a dozen different research teams on Cornell's campus looking at different aspects of these kinds of issues. My group is looking mostly at the social issues and economic issues, but there are other people looking at a lot of the more hydrological issues, technical issues, and we're pretty well networked with people in other places. So this is a pretty rapidly evolving space, you know, from a research and a policy perspective. So I'd be happy if you know, to either put you in touch with other people who know more about other things or to come back at some time in the future.
Great.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna listen in on Terry too, so because I haven't heard him talk for a
Great.
while, if you don't mind.
Not at all. Terry, do you just want to launch in? Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, no, thank you guys for having me. And thanks, David, for that presentation. It's good to hear about what's going on the solar side of things, since I've, you know, slowly drifted away from that for the most part. You know, I want to, you know, first address, you know, obviously Osamu has left for Tetra Tech. It's, I'm not going to lie, a bit of a blow for us. He was a huge part of what we were able to do with the climate smart communities, and we'll certainly miss him. But thankfully we've, you know, brought in Amy, you know, a recent grad from CRP to help back us up and continue on with the good work. And so, you know, we're going to continue to help out with the town of Lansing and hopefully help you achieve what you're looking to do. So, you know, with the natural resource inventory, CJ sent me the latest version, and we've already started to input it into kind of that kind of final report format, and we're looking through it, you know, seeing what we can do to help that process along. And I guess, you know, what I want to hear from all of you is really how we can help in that process. If there's any specific things that you want us to take a look at that maybe haven't been done yet, you know, following on, I think something that Tom said, you know, to David, is there any particular things in light of the solar conversation that, you know, you want us to be taking a look at? You know, I know the NRIs, you know, typically cover the different soil types and mention that, but, you know, is there anything else? You know, we cover slope, we cover, obviously, like I said, the soil types, the watersheds, but if there's anything else, you know, we're certainly willing to jump in and take a look at that. And Amy's currently working on a natural resource inventory for the town of Hector. So, you know, we're working forward on all of this and really standing by to help you out with that. And then the other thing that I'll mention is we also got the bills from CJ for the town of Lansing, the utility bills. We have a giant stack of maybe Sue, thank you for that. They're currently sitting in my office. Well, you know, once we're able to go back in, I'll be going in and I'll be photocopying all of them, or scanning them rather, and then starting to make heads or tails of them. So we're going to start getting started on that as well with the greenhouse gas inventory.
Nice. If I could just jump in for a second, I would say I think one of our last outstanding pieces is actually the open space section, and I've kind of been torn about exactly how to approach that. I know some organizations aren't necessarily comfortable with sharing very specific parcel data, so I'm wondering if there's a better way to kind of, you know, maybe buffer those or anonymize that maybe to some extent. Also having a more comprehensive list of that. I followed that thread. I didn't respond to it, but I did see the thread that Karen's and Robin had been corresponding back and forth on about the various parcels. And so I have a draft going to Terry about those, as well as the farms that are protected under the Forever Farm program, the FPIG, of which there's at least two, Ben's View and the Hauser farm as well. So I'm kind of, I'd say for me, I know the next step really is for us to do an open space inventory, at which point I think the Conservation Advisory Council may have some interest in becoming, of formally approaching the town board to actually become a conservation board. But and I think that would be, you know, useful, especially on larger projects needing environmental review. But I'm wondering if it might be useful to at least have a snapshot of the open space piece in the NRI, and then kind of build on that with with the open space index to follow, because we're going to follow, I think, and we've been sort of talking about our long-term approach, but I think we are planning to follow the green print approach that we had been corresponding a little bit with Professor Minner and her class, a CRP class, that part of the work that you did. And then really, amending the zoning, doing environmental protection overlay districts. I know those are priority of some of our town board members, and then continuing on essentially that path of kind of implementing some of those, regulatory and non-regulatory pieces. So I'm a little stuck on that one exactly, kind of the extent of which we'd really want to document open space in the NRI, or whether we just want to kind of kick that to, its own individual document. So, but I, happy to discuss and see what you think is best.
And I'll say, we've done it both ways with municipalities. Some municipalities already have some of that, in place, and they've done some of that documentation. And we've just kind of inserted that as part of it. And others, this is definitely the step towards that. And so I'd have to take a look at, a couple of the other examples that we've done to see exactly how we've handled it. I don't know off the top of my head, but I think there's probably a way of mentioning it in some way, even if it's not going fully into depth, that, still allows a platform to continue moving forward and addressing that as something that, you want to come out of this.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, because I think we're going to try to follow that trajectory, towards green printing and kind of the end goals of really being able to articulate really clearly about the town's conservation goals as well as our development goals, right? Try to, be sure to have a good balance there. So that would be helpful. I mean, even if it's just like a snapshot, a page or two of some of the parcels that we can, include on that, open space map. The CAC's done an amazing job of reviewing. I know, sorry, Robin, for frustrating you to no end with that online Word document. I'm sorry. We'll try to remedy that for the next go around. We used OneDrive, and it's the formatting issues were a little wonky, but so yeah, thank you so much for all the work that you've done with that. I think it's headed in a really great direction. Now, we did want to also do, I think one other piece the CAC wanted, or I wanted to see happen would be, a map open house. That's kind of a fun thing to do as part of an NRI, but I don't know how we could necessarily do that unless we move towards, I think we had spoken about doing a story map. And you and I talked about that a little bit, about doing a story map of some of the maps might be really cool, kind of follow-up fun idea, also a way to, get the information out to people in a really interesting way. So I don't know what your, kind of workload looks like. I don't want to be piling things onto you, but I know that county planning or county GIS, I can't remember which one, did offer to do some hosting for that. But we do have ArcGIS online subscription now, so we actually have that operational, and if the town had to host it, we certainly could. I've never done the story map before, so, but I know that county IT or county GIS could certainly help us with that if you kind of maybe were willing to work on some of the pieces. So
yeah, and actually it's good timing on this. So Amy is actually looking at the whole story map concept as part of her work with us this summer. And we've done a climate vulnerability assessment that was part of one of the last things that Osamu did for us with the town of Caroline. And he left us with a 70-page report, which is fantastic. But most people don't want to kind of sift through a 70-page report. And so what we've been looking at doing is trying to translate that into something a little bit more user-friendly, something that, is people are going to be willing to take a look at. And the story map was kind of where we settled. So we're slowly, we just started that this week of looking into the process with the town of Caroline for the climate vulnerability assessment. But, provided that heads in the right direction, I think it's a great idea, try and do that with the natural resource inventories.
CJ, if you have any questions about story maps, I have pretty extensive, very extensive experience.
Oh, well,
yeah.
Karen is here to assist also, which is fabulous. Thank you so much. That's what we're I'm thinking, because I think we originally envisioned as part of the scope of work to really do a nice plotter printed maps, you know, like big maps, and have people come into town hall and look at the maps and interact with them and, you know, really see them and, you know, kind of a really big scale way. But, you know, there's this whole thing, pesky pandemic, and then, you know, there we are. So but it also seems like a really useful tool to make them dynamic as well. So yeah, Karen, if you'd be interested in participating in some of that, I kind of see this as a nice bridge in between kind of our open space inventory / natural resources index and that NRI, you know, heading towards the green print direction. And I think Professor Minner wants to continue to help with her class in the fall with running some of those scenarios that we had talked about. So I think we're, you know, this is, you know, playing into a larger, you know, process that I think could be really fabulous to have that. So.
This is Dave Wolf again. I think we did talk about, I guess the story map thing fits into this, but the idea, a lot of projects I've worked on, which are like technical, very thorough climate assessments, have an executive summary. Going back to the people don't want to read, you know, sometimes there may be a particular issue and it's good to have a detailed section of a report like that to go look at the nitty gritty, but something where, you know, everybody on the town board reading a 5-page document might be surprised. Maybe we might identify some things that might be a surprise to some people that have even grown up here, that we sort of uncovered in terms of the percent of land that is here or there, or some vulnerable areas, or in general, as we've gone through this whole process, some regions of the, some components of the region that seem to really stand out as needing special attention in terms of conservation. But anyway, kind of, we'd have to all sort of look at it all. I haven't read it all more carefully, and maybe brainstorm and compare notes and come to some conclusions about things we thought that, yeah, we could all agree on. That would be good to, a way to summarize it. That's more work, of course. So maybe if that's never done, you know, we don't do it, but I'm just thinking that's, it could be, make it more useful perhaps.
Yeah, I'll say that we haven't done those yet for a natural resource inventory. I don't think it's impossible to do it. It would definitely have to be, you know, the call, you know, of all of you, what would be specifically called out in that natural resource inventory executive summary. You know, the executive summary is, you know, trying to highlight the main points. And I think the tricky part with an NRI is that there's no like key part, right? There's no, I mean, it's an inventory. You're trying to cover everything basically and give insight into everything. But if you wanted to specifically highlight, you know, specific pieces and then talk about where they might be relevant, you know, so saying, you know, the natural resource inventory covers these 3 things that are relevant to development in this area. It covers these 4 things that might be relevant to a solar law that we're thinking of enacting. It covers, you know, these 2 things that are really relevant to the waterfront, you know, issues that we might be facing. So that might be a specific, you know, piece that you want to call out in an executive summary type thing.
Yeah. Could also be that there might be, you know, it would take more knowledge than I have and some detective work, I guess, but some things that are just unique to this region, you know, comparing it to other regions. So, you know, compared to many other regions in upstate New York, we have the most of this, or we have, this is very, some things that are very special about our area, you know, so. They might go to that section and say, oh yeah, well, I want to really find out more about this thing that we have that's unique. Anyway, so I don't have any preconceived ideas, but I think it could be interesting, but it's a big piece of work to really do that, I guess.
Well, I think Karen's got a lot of great experience with the natural, unique natural areas. And she probably knows off the top of her head what the top 10 Lansing you know, special flora or fauna would be. So
yeah, so something like that, just to have that in there alone, yeah. And
it could be fun.
I tried to write up that I did.
aliens. Oh,
Not coming through, Karen, unless it's a special code.
oh, okay. Well, we can follow up by email.
Got my
Oh.
headset on now. You back?
There she is.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
there you are.
So what I was saying was that when I wrote up that section on the UNAs for the document, there's something like, I don't know, maybe 30 UNAs in Lansing, and I pulled out the, wrote longer descriptions of the nicest ones, because there is an internal ranking system, and so we could certainly, use those without giving away too much, because we've always been pretty cautious about not encouraging plundering of plants and stuff on site, so we have to be kind of general.
So maybe some of them could be tied to actual map areas, but maybe some of the maps could be, buffered in a way where, almost like those maps that the natural heritage folks make that are kind of, really broad.
Well, no, I mean, we can be more specific than that, because the boundaries of the UNAs are public. We just don't want to put, a big X on the map that says, here's where the orchids are, that sort of thing.
Go pick them. Right. Okay. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I think that could be, what do you think of that, Karen? Could that be a good kind of piece to pull from the NRI to kind of highlight, you think?
I think that, but I also think we should as a group really add to the scenic views. I can't remember what the thing is that the county put together, but there was some inventory that they did of view sheds maybe, and I think that we could, that's something that we could do collectively and really feature it, because a lot of those are not, they haven't really been codified. There's not a known list, and I know that there's some beautiful view sheds both to and from sites in Lansing that didn't make it into the county's document. So it's just another thought, but I think that would play really well also in a story map, because you could really analyze the site in an interesting way, both visually from an aesthetic standpoint, but then also go into a whole set of different aspects and drill down, to the soils, to the slopes, to maybe density and farmland protection, whatever.
That's a great idea, and it sounds like we could also use that for with a little bit of extra analysis. We could actually use that in a regulatory way as part of a environmental protection overlay district eventually. Okay.
Yeah, and the nice thing about the story maps too, I mean, there's probably more than a couple dozen already set templates, plus you can customize your own to build something in a way that's really they've really beefed it up in the last year or so. So I've been having a lot of fun working with that lately. But the story map journal format is really interesting, and you can keep adding to it. Once you start it, it's going to be kind of open-ended, and it's very easy to take stuff out and put new stuff in as situations evolve.
So looking at the NRI, it looks like we're really coming along nicely. The one place I noticed that that hasn't been worked on is the scenic resources inventory. And the county looks like they've done a pretty good job. There's what I counted, there's 68 sites in Lansing. So I was wondering if we want to include that in the NRI.
I think that might have been in the original scope. Let me take a look.
Yeah, it's in there, but nothing's really been added to it. I mean, even if we just took what the county has done and sum it up for the town of Lansing, that would be nice. But as Karen says, there's probably many more scenic areas that are not included.
Yeah, we do list the scenic resources as something we had wanted to include. And we could at least start with the county areas, and then as part of the open space index, actually follow up with our own local version of that. That's a possibility also, just to kind of get the natural resources inventory rolling along towards, although my understanding is that the CFA is going to come out at the end of the summer. So we're buying ourselves a few more months in terms of the climate smart communities piece, as far as getting the NRI actually adopted. I think just a resolution from the town board saying, yes, we're going to use this document, I think is enough. Correct me if I'm wrong, Terry, for the climate smart communities points. So we're actually in good shape because that's been postponed. So probably more like August or September is when the CFA actually will be due. So if there's even money in the climate smart communities, who knows? I mean, maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there will be money. The last time I talked to DEC, there was still hope that there would be money, put forth in the program. And I think, some of them are trying to position it as, maybe one of the elements of recovering from this is this funds being provided to municipalities. But on the scenic resources side, I was just taking a look at what we did in the town of Ulysses NRI. And, we started off with, I think we have about 10 or 12 different pictures that are included there that show some of the different scenic resources out of the 58 that there are in the town of Ulysses. And, include some of the pictures, give a little bit of a background of them. And then at the end, we kind of included a map of where all of those views are, within the town of Ulysses, and kind of just, pretty much laid them out as, being, well, let me take a look here. We laid them out as being distinctive views, noteworthy views, characteristic views, and kind of showed them on the map as all being different. So I think that's definitely one way that you guys can take it, is use that as an example.
We could work with the town of Ulysses and do complementary environmental protection scenic overlays.
I think you'll find that some of the views or some of the scenic resources are likely the same, since looking at this map, there's a bunch that are right in the middle of the lake. So I think you'll have a few of similar ones.
Nice.
Yeah. So one thing that I wanted to bring up as well is, CJ had sent me an email earlier this week, or maybe it was even last week, about Pledge Element 7 and conserving natural habitats and the required documentation for that. And so I guess I'm still trying to get a full understanding of what the situation is, but it sounds like someone's buying some land and there's a town resolution basically in support of that. Is that correct?
I think Tom could probably speak to this
Okay.
perhaps the best. I think this is about the Bell Station property, Tom, that you forwarded. I sent it on to Terry.
Yeah. So yeah, there's approximately 500 acres of land with over 3,400 feet of lake frontage that's owned by NYSEG.
Mm-hmm.
And in the comprehensive plan, we have it as a future public access parcel, and it's a state priority parcel that the state would like to get as a state forest or wildlife management area or something. And yeah, the town did pass a resolution in, I believe it was 2013, supporting that. So the ball is kind of in NYSEG's court. I know Finger Lakes Land Trust is still working on that, but it's really up to NYSEG.
Yeah, so for submitting the action, you have the first element of it that you need, which is having documentation that it's listed as a priority area for conservation and having that prior to the actual acquisition. The second part is really, I guess, that demonstration of how the town was, not necessarily involved in the acquisition, but how it supported the acquisition either by themselves or, by a partner, such as Finger Lakes Land Trust. And so if it hasn't been done yet, I think you might run into difficulties with submitting it. But once it's complete, I think you would be fine with submitting the resolution. Even better would be if there was a conservation easement on it that was, passed. That's something that generally we've seen submitted by a lot of communities, but I think you might be able to get away with the resolution as well, if you provided you have those two pieces.
We have the resolution, and then the future land use map in the comprehensive plan. It's designated as an area for public recreation or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's basically as far as the town can go at this point.
Yeah, and I think with those two, you're good. I think that the tricky part is that it hasn't been done yet. Right. So is my understanding of it, at least. Right. So you're still waiting on NYSEG to actually sell the land to the Finger Lakes Land Trust. So once that's completed, you should be good. But I don't think the DEC is going to reward points for something that hasn't been completed yet.
Well, who knows when that's going to be complete.
Yeah.
I was trying to interface with Terry to see if maybe there was something we could do as part of the climate smart communities to kind of help facilitate that action or somehow lend support to that. So that was kind of my point in highlighting that you, Doug, as I think Sue dug that up and you sent it along. I wanted to make sure that it wasn't, I know it's certainly not forgotten by anyone on CAC, but that it's not just lurking out there in thin air or forgotten. So
is it, and you also brought up the Sims parcel. Is that a similar situation?
Sims was actually purchased. The town did support that WQIP application, and the Finger Lakes Land Trust did submit a winning application, and they did, as far as I know, close the deal. So yeah, we have that documentation for sure.
And that was also one that was put in, there was a plan ahead of time that suggested that was a land that should be a priority to be conserved or.
I don't know if it was in the towns, though, maybe I'd have to look at the resolution, but the town articulated all the reasons for supporting the acquisition, and that it was also, of course, in the county's natural features focus areas and all the kind of good rationale essentially for why the town supported the acquisition.
Yeah, so that one I think you could definitely submit then, and for that one I would submit, what the county had, put forth as it being, an area for conservation, I think, and then include the resolution itself. And I think that could be looked on favorably. It's, it's always tricky. They like to see a little bit more than a resolution. Like they like to see the conservation easement specifically. But within the action itself, it really lists out, in terms of what to submit, they leave it a little bit open-ended. So they say, depending on the mechanism of conservation, it can be copies of conservation easements, land acquisition documents, zoning ordinances, or other land use regulations. So you might be able to get around it that way.
That one I'm almost positive is eligible. I mean, if NYSEG or the DEC's own WQIP program that paid for the acquisition is not good enough, then I don't really know what would be. So yeah, if we didn't pass that on to Osama, we can make sure we get that to you.
Yeah, please do, and we'll definitely upload it. And this goes for anything else as you're moving forward. We can start to upload these documents, get everything set. And as I said, we're going to start working hopefully in the next week or two here. My office is opening up later this or next week, it sounds like, so I'll be able to get in there and start working on the greenhouse gas inventory and going through those documents. In terms of that process, just to lay it out for all of you, what we plan on doing is going through the data, obviously, putting it into the calculator that we use to do the greenhouse gas inventories, and then start to generate a report based off of that. One question I would have for all of you, and it really is a decision, for all of you to make, is with other municipalities, they've specifically asked us to look at methane a little bit differently on the basis of some of the research that's going on at Cornell. And the outsized impact that methane as a greenhouse gas has. We've had other municipalities say specifically that they wouldn't like us to do that. So I guess it is a little bit of a question of how you all would like this to be handled. And we're happy to set it out as a separate section. I think that's the town of Caroline's the town of Dryden is in the process of doing a greenhouse gas inventory with a consultant. And I worked with a consultant to do the methane side of it, and they're going to include that as a separate section. That's certainly something that we can do as well. But I wanted to make sure that we covered that, before we embark on this.
I'm not sure. I mean, what would we do in terms of a methane inventory?
So it's not so much a methane inventory as, so the research that's come out of Cornell, specifically by, Bob Howarth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for those of you that are unfamiliar, it's essentially showing that, methane as a greenhouse gas is roughly 86 times more potent than carbon dioxide when it's released into the atmosphere on a 20-year time horizon. And once you account for that, typically a lot of the greenhouse gas inventories haven't been looking at that. They've been using 100-year time horizons instead. When they're calculating the global warming potential. And so once you lower that down to the 20-year time horizon, you use that 86 times as potent as carbon dioxide, it really starts to change the calculus. And the reason it's important is because the whole point of a greenhouse gas inventory is to recognize where are our major sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And then the next step after the greenhouse gas inventory is to create a climate action plan that basically says, if we're looking to lower our emissions, here are the places that the most emissions are occurring, and this is how we can address it. And so if you have a greenhouse gas inventory that hasn't been done to account for this new look on methane, and it shows that, really electricity is the major source of your emissions, you might say, okay, we need to target everything, in terms of electricity. We have to reduce, the amount of electricity that we're using. We have to, change out the light bulbs. We don't want to really look at electric vehicles, that type of thing. You have a second greenhouse gas inventory that's really looking at, okay, what's going on with natural gas, what's going on with methane. And if that's showing that really natural gas use is your major source of greenhouse gas emissions, it might change the tactics. It might say, okay, we need to install, heat pumps. We need to make sure that we're heading as far as we can in that direction. And obviously the situation is a little bit more complicated in Lansing because of the moratorium, but it's definitely something that factors into the decision-making.
This is Dave Wolf. I know a little bit about this area, and it is just, I think we could discuss methane from both ways. It's really just arbitrary, the time frame you look at these greenhouse gases. But it turns out that methane has a fairly shorter lifespan in the atmosphere before it degrades than nitrous oxide, for example. So nitrous oxide, it doesn't make much difference whether you're looking at a 100-year time frame or a 25-year time frame. It's 300 times more potent. Methane, it makes a big difference. It's not like it was new research. It's just a matter of let's look at a different time frame, and it to kind of point out how when you're viewing things from a shorter time perspective, methane's quite important. So it's not right or wrong. It's just arbitrary kind of. So, but I think it's us to acknowledge that we are aware of those two ways of looking at methane, at least, I think if, you know, like in the whole fracking argument, obviously people would prefer to use the 20-year time frame because it really makes some of the methane stuff really stand out, and it's fine. I mean, it's important. So it's just arbitrary, and I think we should point out that we're aware of that, those different ways of looking at it. Most of the climate change literature has always looked at a 100-year time frame and comparing fuels to molecule basis of global warming potential. But in a short time frame, methane is very important. CO2 is going to always dominate the long-term 100-year time frame issue we're going to have with climate change. But
I believe the government's climate plan looks at methane at the 20-year scale.
Could be, yeah.
And the most recent IPCC report, you know, suggested that folks start to use that shorter time frame. And you know, the other piece of it, and you're right, David, that it's not new research. I think the part of it that is new research that, you know, Bob and some of the others are on the leading edge of is also has to do with the leakage rates.
Yeah, the leakage.
Yeah.
And that's something else, you know, that we've done some work on, you know, with Bob and with others. That's something that the town of Dryden incorporated into their greenhouse gas inventory. The Tompkins County itself in their 2014 greenhouse gas inventory included a section on it. And that's certainly something that, you know, we can include as well when we're looking at, you know, performing an inventory. You know, my personal suggestion is to do it along the lines of what Tompkins County did in 2014. You know, to really say, okay, you know, this is a greenhouse gas inventory if we do it the standard way, but if we're using, you know, what we believe to be the best science available now, you know, this is really what we're starting to look at. And what does this mean, you know, for how we move ahead with, you know, our decision making?
Yeah, I'd say, yeah, I'm good with something like that. Like I say, it's just a matter of pointing out, it's, yeah, calculating things on different time frames. And there's, yeah, I'm old enough now. 20-year time frame is a good time frame to think about. So not a 100-year time. I saw Robin had a question about where's the methane leaking from. And
yeah, I was wondering about where that comes from and what data do we have? Does the data that you have, Terry, does it parse the CO2 from the methane?
I'll let Terry answer that, but also just to start, I mean, you know, it's a big issue with fracking, which we don't have. That's not happening here because there's a leakage in that whole process. But we have a lot of dairy, and dairy manure has the methane release associated just with the manure itself. If it's wet manure, there's a methanogen bacteria involved in the breakdown of wet manure, and because it's an anaerobic process. And then of course the cows themselves, their digestive process has bacteria, methane producing bacteria in their gut. So all the dairy cows in the region are releasing methane.
Yeah, and on the energy side of things, I think it has, you know, it's really looking at the life cycle. It's looking, you know, from when you're drawing it out of the fracking wells, you're sending it through all the pipes, through all the compressor stations. It's adding up little by little to being, you know, roughly in the realm of, you know, the number that Bob wants to use nowadays is 3.6%. He believes it's somewhere between 3 and 6%, and he's, I think, settling on a more conservative angle, 6%, you know, over the total life cycle emissions from wellhead to where it gets to your house. So
yeah, so we might not be
largely
like we might not be fracking here, but if we're using gas that's been produced through fracking, we have some of that. There's that greenhouse gas embedded in what we're using, you might say, like greenhouse gas emission.
And it's important to understand that almost all of the natural gas that we're using, and especially this part of New York State, is coming from the wells in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, no, so that's actually part of our story for sure.
Yeah, thanks for that.
We should probably move on just in the interest of time. Are there any burning questions about the NRI or how we're going to move forward?
In terms of cooperative extension, I'll say, you know, we're working on putting all of the information that you all put together, that CJ has passed on to us. We're starting to do some, light editing to it and starting to put it into the format. If you all want to take a look at taking on the scenic resources section and handing that off to us, we're definitely interested in incorporating it. I heard, David and Karen talking a little bit about having a separate section, an executive summary type section. That's definitely something that, we're happy to work with you on, or let you take that on, as you see fit.
Can we make a decision now about who would maybe take charge of the scenic resources part and also the executive summary?
Well, I could start by just reading the entire document, which I haven't done yet. So I could go through the whole document, and I'd be open to like starting a discussion about whether we even want to do an executive summary, going through the document and just my own personal kind of take on some things that maybe stood out to me, and then see if that generates some discussion among all of us, and a feeling that there could be some little interesting nuggets to pull out there for a general audience.
So David, my memory is that we did have that discussion and that we did want to have an executive summary. Do other people see it differently?
I think I remember it being discussed. I don't remember where we came down on it.
I think an executive summary is a good idea. As you say, people don't want to read a whole document these days.
Yeah.
And Tom, were you saying that the Tompkins County NRA had a pretty thorough section on scenic resources?
Yes.
If I was to take on that, I might just do it offline and then email a paragraph or however many paragraphs to somebody to put in that document, because the online document doesn't work for me. But I could do it offline.
Okay.
Especially, I think I heard that somebody was going to put it into what's the Adobe, the Illustrator. So there may not be, I don't know what version control we're going to use to keep that separate. But yeah, I guess I'm not sure what the best way to send edits or updates are now. If Terry or someone is putting it into Illustrator.
So
or InDesign, maybe it was InDesign.
Yeah, so once, I would say you can send it directly to me, and I'm still willing to do that. I want to make sure that, all of you get a chance to look at it and make any comments. So, if you put something together and everyone is happy with it, and, you can either send it to me or CJ can send it to me, and we'll work on it from there. But, as long as you guys get it to the point where everyone in the group is happy with it, we're able to take it from there.
So maybe Robin could send it to all of us in an attached Word document, and would that work? And we can just make comments back to Robin, and then you could send it to Terry.
Yeah, I hate to make it worse for everybody and have yet another version of documents going around, but for whatever reason, the online one just doesn't save changes.
So sorry.
No, I mean, it doesn't even have to be a Word document. I could just put it in an email or whatever works for other people, a Google Doc, and just in the body of the email.
Let's do Word so that we can track changes by person, unless, or alternatively, after you write it, Robin, then we go ahead and we channel it through CJ to get it online, so that we can all look at it. That's another way. I don't know what you think about that, CJ.
Yeah, I'd be fine with if you want to circulate it amongst yourselves in terms of the Word document. I realize that OneDrive certainly has its limits. Perhaps something different is in order for the next project. So we tried it though, so we tried it. If you want to circulate it and then send me essentially a final version, I can do kind of a last look at it, as it were, and then pass it on to Terry and Amy at CCE and go from there. If you're all comfortable with that, me kind of making a final edit on it.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, yeah, sounds good. What kind of timeline do we have here? So Robin, how long do you think it might take? Or is it too early to even ask that question?
I don't know what I've committed to, but when do you need it by? When do you want it?
So I'll say we're working on your timeline. So whenever it works for the group, and just so you have a little bit of a better sense of what you're getting yourself into, in the chat, I put a link to the Ulysses Natural Resource Inventory, and they have a section, like I said, on scenic resources. So you can take a look at that and hopefully don't feel like you doomed yourself too much.
Well, our final deadline is August or something, right? Because August, September, it's really got to be done, right? So we're talking something like July, mid-July or something.
Like by the next meeting.
Yeah, if Robin, we could, I could help you get it, you know, and I can help you with this. Don't feel like you're on your own there. If we can get that ready for the next CAC meeting to kind of start doing that section. Terry, do you think you'd have kind of the remainder of the NRI maybe in layout so we can kind of see, you know, mostly where we're heading? I don't want to rush you or anything.
Yeah, we'll make sure that happens.
And then Dave, as far as your offer for pulling out all those juicy tidbits, is that something that we might be able to have in almost final form by the next meeting in July?
Yeah, I just got a proposal. Well, we've almost got a proposal completed at work, my day job. So I think it's possible. I can give that a shot.
Great.
Going back to the scenic resources, I think you said there's also, they had some pictures, like just some nice. Photos, you know? So seems like when Robin starts identifying some of those or whatever, maybe some of us who live near wherever some of those are could do our best for the
There's pictures included right in the inventory. Already taken.
Oh, already taken.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Never mind then.
From the counties.
I was going to say if more were wanted, I'd be happy to go and try and take some of the identified places if more are needed. Be happy to help out with that.
That sounds like a great offer.
As soon as we start to develop a list or use that list and add to it, we can take a look at what the photos are, and I can see what I can do.
Nice.
Now, are we limited to what this official designation of a scenic resource?
No, there's no such thing currently. It's you know, you'll see looking in the inventory. I don't know if you sent along the Tompkins County one or just the Ulysses one, but the Tompkins County, I think it pulls from the Tompkins County Scenic Inventory. Okay, so Robin, we can get you a link to the Tompkins County version, but you'll see that that's somewhat objective criteria, but you know, there's no regulatory force in any of them, which is, you know, kind of what we'd be heading towards. Yeah, okay, nice. Terry just sent it to you, to everybody. Nice.
Yeah, I think I'm sure I have that link somewhere, but I'll just throw it up here in my window since it's open. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't sure if I know like unique natural area is an official designation. You can't just say something is a unique natural area, but I wasn't sure about scenic resources. If somebody knew of one that wasn't on the list, could we put it on there?
Yeah, it's a good question. We can of course add to that. That's the thing, like this is our inventory, so or the town's inventory, I should say. So if there's other locations beyond the ones that are in the Tompkins County inventory, there are a mess of them already in there. I can't remember how many you said, Tom.
68.
That's very accurate. Great. specific number. So that's kind of a lot already. And Robin, we may be able to get the source files for those photos. Tompkins County Planning might actually still have them. So if we need them to, and Terry, maybe you can speak to this, how you put the Ulysses one together.
I'm trying to remember. I think we did ask GIS for the files, and I can work with them to try and get it. They're most, I think they're furloughed right now, so that might be the only
Yeah.
thing. But we'll find a way.
Okay.
Okay, so shall we move on to the last item?
Yeah, I think it was just
Planning?
the update on the climate smart communities completed actions. We hit a little bit on that, I think.
Right.
And I did send around the planning report. You should have received my monthly planning report, and just wondering if you have any questions. I will save everyone from me verbalizing the many pages of that and just leave it open to questions.
I just have a comment that you got a lot done and continue to get a lot done looking at that report.
It's amazing working from home. You wouldn't believe it. Well, thank you. That's nice of you to say. I'm happy to help.
Great. So in the interest of not keeping people for 2 hours, but just a little over 1.5, I would propose that we bring our meeting to a close unless there's some pressing item. Okay with you, Tom?
Yeah, sounds good.
Right. I call the meeting to an end and we adjourn.
Hey, excellent.
Everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
It's great seeing you all.
Bye.
Okay.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Terry and Amy.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.